Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Up first, Western premiers meeting this week, including David Eby, say they are disappointed in the federal government for what they say is lagging on bail reform. What changes are needed, and how should the justice system address repeat offenders? Plus, we'll hear about new mental health services announced today for youth and safety from abuse in sport. We'll speak with soccer player Sierra McCormack and ask you how sports should address abuse and protect athletes. That's after 12:30. I'm Michelle Eliot. This is BC Today. Despite initial promises by the federal government, reforms to the bail system were not passed before Parliament rose for the summer last week. That's attracted criticism from premiers across the country. And here in BC, David Eby says it's an issue that needs urgent attention. He was with counterparts yesterday in Whistler for their annual meeting and called the federal government to prioritize a bail reform bill that targets repeat offenders.
We discussed crime and the bail reform bill that was not passed at the federal level, and our shared urging to the federal government to prioritize the passage of that bill, and our shared deep disappointment that that bill was not passed in the recent parliamentary session.
We'd like to hear from you on this today. Does the federal government need to act more quickly on bail reform? What changes would you like to see to the bail system in Canada? And how should repeat offenders be treated by the justice system? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733 on your cell phone star or pound 690. You can also email bctoday@cbc.ca. And my guest today has studied the topic of recidivism and how to treat people before they go down the track of becoming a repeat offender. Dr. Julian Summers is a clinical psychologist at the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University, and he joins me now. Good afternoon to you.
Pleasure to join you. Thank you.
Well, tell us more about what you have found out in your research, first of all.
Well, it spans about 20 years, and the most informative set of information relates to a linkage of everybody who is either incarcerated or sentenced in the province of BC, linked to their health services and the diagnoses, importantly, that they had prior to their most recent offense. And what we see is, starting around 10 years ago, the proportion of people that are locked up in BC that were previously diagnosed, especially with substance use disorders, increased. And we had previously shown that among all of the mental disorders that people can be diagnosed with, the diagnosis of substance use is the one that is most strongly connected with the likelihood of a subsequent conviction. So when we saw that increasing proportion of people year over year with substance use disorders being incarcerated in BC, it was not a surprise to see that the average number of prior convictions among that population went up from about three and a half, an average, that's the average number of prior convictions before the most recent one, to over 6. And so essentially what we have seen play out in front of us is an increasing use of detention for people with substance use disorders who are becoming more and more in the category of what we call prolific offenders. It's essentially a revolving door that is spinning more quickly.
And so what do you make of the action that you've seen, first of all, the recommendations from the province and what's being considered when it comes to bail reform and dealing with the substance use aspect of it?
So, two things sort of call out for attention simultaneously. One is sensitivity to the needs of people who are themselves victims of violent offenses and who may have been prevented from that had the individual that committed the violent act been detained on bail. So there's that phenomenon. But if we step back and look at the big picture, we need to do much more than detain people who are increasingly going through our justice system during that relatively short period of time in and around either sentencing or other brief periods that would be affected by bail reform. We need to instead be looking at the kinds of things that have been shown to help prevent the next offense and the one after that, and bring this population of repeat offenders down. There's no way to do that through mechanisms like bail reform. It requires diverting people from the justice system more permanently.
And tell me more about that, those diversions that are needed in that in-between period to prevent recidivism.
There are two things that have helped or that have resulted in diversion that we've had a chance to investigate quite carefully and write about. One of them is kind of a category of interventions that are triggered by the justice system itself. So things like community court, which in Vancouver was run for many years by Judge Gove, or drug treatment court, which exists in many places. Those programs do successfully divert people from future offending, and they do it by investing resources and essentially helping people to redirect their lives. There's another approach that has shown about the same overall impact in terms of crime reduction, but that is completely voluntary. And this is something that was a series of randomized trials known as at-home chez soi, done across Canada a number of years ago. And in Vancouver, we asked people for their consent to get access to all sorts of records about their activities, including involvement with crime. And what we found is that people who were frequently involved with courts and corrections, but who were given the choice of accessing housing and support, first of all, they took us up on that. And the difference between their future offending and people who were randomized to receive usual care, the health authority, BC Housing, et cetera, was 71% lower rate of convictions in the very next year. So this is about on par with the magnitude of change that we've seen attainable in these specialized court programs. Mm-hmm. But again, the key difference is that we're engaging people, if I could say, between offenses. They're making voluntary choices without a metaphorical gun to their head, and we can achieve the same results. However you look at it, all of these interventions that result in diverting people from future crime address some of the reasons that they're being arrested in the first place. And many of these, again, involve people with untreated substance use disorders who are committing what we would refer to, I guess, as crimes of survival, mostly theft. So that's really, what we need to kind of get our heads around from my perspective. Mm-hmm. We know we can help people. Reforming the bail system isn't really going to, it can't possibly result in that kind of long-term change. It also, especially for people with substance use disorders, and especially those who consume opioids, it actually can increase some of their risk because the period of time they're detained is likely to be associated with a reduction in their tolerance, and fatal poisonings are much more probable in the little window immediately following either release from prison or discharge from hospital.
Dr. Summers, what do you say then to the criticism from, we hear from politicians and those who say what we have right now when it comes to the bail system is that, the term is, the catchphrase is catch and release, revolving door. What do you say to that criticism?
Well, I think that's apt. We are, in a sense, catching people, detaining people who have really obvious unmet needs that have little to do with the reform capabilities of the justice system in general. They have untreated mental illnesses concurrent with their untreated substance use disorders. They have housing-related and vocation or work-related needs, needs for support, and needs that almost everybody will accept help with. but we're not turning our attention to that. In BC, it's familiar for people to hear. We have this incredibly tragic, ongoing, daily death toll due to drugs, and there's very little discussion of, well, what about the people who are going to be at risk tomorrow? Because the only way we can have an ongoing mortality crisis is if we keep replacing people at risk. There's very little attention given in our planning and our discourse to risk reduction.
Okay.
If we turned attention to risk reduction, we'd start to bring into view the very people that we're talking about, who are committing crimes associated with their own survival and who can be relieved of that burden, but only if we give them the opportunity for life off of the streets and with other meaningful things to be engaged with.
Dr. Julian Summers is my guest, clinical psychologist at SFU's Faculty of Health Sciences. And you've heard his perspective there. You heard from Premier David Eby talking about the federal government not passing bail reform before it rose for the summer, and Premier saying they're disappointed in that. They would like to see action from the federal government on bail reform. We're asking you for your thoughts on this. What changes do you want to see to Canada's bail system, and how should the justice system deal with repeat offenders? Our phone numbers are 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. On your cell phone, star or pound 690. And Ryan is calling us now from Vancouver. Hi, Ryan. Welcome to the show.
Hi there. Hi, Michelle. How are you?
I am okay. Thanks very much for calling. What do you want to say about repeat offenders and the bail system in Canada?
Absolutely. So, Michelle, I guess start with one of the examples that I can give to you and your guest down there. So one day I was waiting in a bus stop, just waiting for a bus regular day to go to work, and I remember it was, I guess, a couple of months ago, and there was one gentleman. I felt kind of he was looking at me like very constantly, and I thought that something is kind of like fishy. Why he's like staring at me? Anyways, after 10 minutes or so, he had a kind of metal stick on his hand. He started randomly swinging around and coming towards me. I said, like, man, stop it. What are you doing? Like, you're almost going to hit me. And he said, like, oh, no, I wanna harm somebody. I said, like, whoa. Like, you can't do that, man. I just went away, and I called 911, and a policeman came in. And the guy wasn't there at that time, and they caught him, and the policeman came to me and just informed me what was going on. And he said, like, oh, the guy is already waiting for a court decision or something. At that time, I didn't understand if he's waiting a court decision, why he's on the streets, you know? So technically, I guess it just comes up to your point, Michelle. A couple of minutes ago, you mentioned that catch and release. Apparently, he was caught with some kind of crime, and he just committed again. Imagine that stick would hit my neck or something. It would be just divided into two pieces. So it was really unbelievable, and it's just really unfortunate, you know.
Yeah.
And
go ahead, Ryan. Go ahead.
Yeah. So and my point is, I guess for this specific situation is, if somebody is making a crime, I guess we shouldn't be allowing to them going on the streets. If the guy or the lady has some specific mental health issues, there's no worse of it putting them on the streets. If you're putting them, they're gonna like hit me, and my life will be in danger, you know. I have heard this from a couple of politicians. They're saying, like, just put behind the bars until they get the court decision or so. So this is the exact example that happened to me, and this is kind of like unfortunate, you know.
Ryan, thanks so much, and I'm sorry that you did go through that, and glad to hear that. Physically, you weren't affected anyway. Thanks very much for the call. That's Ryan in Vancouver. Dr. Summers, I see you nodding there as you're listening to Ryan.
Yeah, Michelle. So the fact is that we're forced to tolerate and live with an increasing amount of chaos, and that's if the tip of the iceberg are the deaths associated with the poisoning crisis, there are many more varieties of personal suffering, and personal harm. Remembering that many of that there's a connection between poisoning, self-harm, and suicide, and people essentially entering a state of despair that often accompanies drug use and that is common among people who survive poisonings and describe their state of mind at the time. And so they're, as I mentioned earlier, often feeling compelled to survive through acts of crime, often thefts, and are living in very chaotic circumstances. And that chaos sometimes results in acts of harm against themselves, but it also results in a higher likelihood of acts of harm against other people, like Ryan. And this is sort of increasing in many communities and is affecting more and more people. When police chiefs commented on the proposal to decriminalize drugs in BC, they expressed their support. This is both the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and the BC Association, but they added a really important rider to that, which is that prior to decriminalization, there must be places where police can take people to receive appropriate assessments and treatment, and those are clearly not available. It was both of the groups of chiefs acknowledged that those resources didn't exist. So we've taken that next step anyway. We're facing an emergency and trying things that it's hoped will make a difference. But in the absence of any kind of long-term or substantive resources that will help people redirect their lives, it's difficult to see how we're going to get out of this multifaceted type of crisis that's putting many people at risk. And of course, the people who are using drugs themselves, but others also, like Ryan.
Let's go to another call. Gunas is joining us from Bella Bella. Hello there.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I would just like to add to the conversation. I previously worked in the federal and provincial institutions on Vancouver Island, working with many people and lots of them were repeat offenders, and almost 100% of them were people that were dealing with addictions, and then who were going to commit crimes in order to continue their addiction when they got back out of prison. I heard the gentleman earlier discussing addictions as a disorder. Well, I personally don't think, this is my own personal opinion, that a disorder should be punishable by incarceration within a federal or provincial institution. If it's a mental disorder, didn't we just abolish all of our those big, terrible places where we used to lock up mentally ill people and just leave them there? We're sort of doing the same thing there and creating repeat offenders within the system. While working in the system, I saw how people are treated in there. And, certainly you got to keep the law, the rules, you got to keep it calm, whatever. But the inhumanity that goes on behind and within those walls and behind those bars creates repeat offenders. And when you've got someone going in there the first time for something to do with a mental health disorder and quite possibly an addiction, that person, the first time in there, they're not prepared for jail at all and would probably never want to go back again. But like I say, by the time they are released, they are fully prepared to go back to prison again. A lot of homelessness
because of those conditions.
People will break laws in order to get back into jail for the winter because there's no houses in the winter time, nowhere for the people to live.
Wow.
I know personally from going through the whole mental wellness, mental health, and addictions programs, attempting to recover my sense of sanity from many years of addiction, I had to abandon the Canadian mental health system to find actual help that would actually help me progress to reattain control over my life, because the mental health system convinces you that you will forever be a victim to addiction. You can never fully recover, and you will be at risk of falling on your face at any point in time. I've been standing tall and clean for over 10 years now, and that's without the mental health system of Canada being involved, because I could not conform to their rules of making myself into a victim that is unable to, I have to admit that I'm powerless over alcohol, I'm powerless over drugs. When you take people's power away from them, that's the first step of breaking down the system.
Gunas, wow, what a story. And I'm glad to hear that you've been in recovery for 10 years. Really appreciate your calling and sharing with us your own experience personally, but also from your work at prisons and the justice
Can I
system.
just also put in here, the Canadian mental health system says you cannot clean up your life for anyone else but yourself. I couldn't do it for myself because I was sad, I was lonely, I was cold, I was afraid, I was homeless. And when a little dog came into my life, her name's Baby Girl. She's 11 pounds. And when that little dog came into my life, she was homeless too. And that she gave me the desire to get off the street. And we got our first home together, and we've been indoors for 10 years. And because we can't do it just for ourselves, we need someone to walk beside us. My family completely abandoned me, but this little 11-pound dog is still with me. Her name's Baby Girl. She saved my life, and she helps me to maintain my lifestyle. She really does. We can't do it alone. We just can't.
No, that's very true. All the best to you and Baby Girl, okay? Thank you very much for the call, Gunas. Let's squeeze in Maureen in Vancouver now. Hi, Maureen. Your thoughts on bail reform and how the justice system should deal with repeat offenders?
Well, obviously, they've just now concurred through a study that the problem is the substance abuse, addiction, whatever you want to call it, right? And I know they started this. I was working in the field of addiction probably 45 years ago. And the BC government came up with this harm reduction. And we those of us who were recovered at the time and working in addiction kind of laughed because we did not think that this would work very effectively for the real alcoholics.
No,
and I
harm
don't
reduction,
know
you
that the
mean?
BC government has ever done an assessment
Okay.
on this program. I've never heard of one. Normally if you try something, you're going to come up with an assessment occasionally. So they're trying everything to be able to support the addicts, etc., say in the downtown east side, right?
Okay.
And it's not working very effectively because, in my opinion, if you're a true, for instance, alcoholic, you can't have a drink occasionally. It will turn into wanting more.
Maureen, if not that, what's needed then, do you think?
I beg your pardon?
What's needed then, do you think?
Well, they got to do an assessment of the current program and then maybe talk to some people there's a lot of people who have recovered and see if they can bring in something in the middle somewhere.
Right.
That works. Okay, I'm going to give you an example.
I have to wrap up. I'm so sorry, Maureen, about that. We do have to go to news. I'm so sorry about that, but I take your point. I don't mean to cut you off.
Can I make one comment?
Sure thing, absolutely.
Okay, I just had a girl come out of detox, nowhere to go because so there's nowhere available for her for follow-up, and she wanted to go into treatment. So what's going to happen to her? Good question. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it is a really good question. In fact, I'll wrap up with that with Dr. Julian Summers. Where will that person go? It sounds to me like what you're talking about is not so much bail reform, but investment.
Yeah, I'm Michelle, and it's not even investment. It's kind of spending differently. There's been so much work that's been done since deinstitutionalization, and unfortunately, the story does play out against that backdrop of really failing in many places, including BC, to make good on the commitment that was paired with deinstitutionalization, providing services closer to home, community-based services. So we need to kind of get our heads around the fact that there is a big unfinished matter of business. But your last two guests really hit crucial points that we need to be recognizing that harm reduction can't stand as a noun. It can't stand as, well, needle exchange or overdose prevention sites. It needs to be a verb. It needs to be something that we start here, but it will follow it as far as we can in the interest of the person's well-being. And if we do that, where we almost invariably find ourselves is supporting them to become members of air quotes, normal communities, people with opportunities for work, opportunities to reconnect with their kids and family members. And that's really what we need to have our sights set on. If we do that, we can also achieve massive reductions in repeat offending and also other things as well, medical emergencies. This is where the cost avoidance comes in, and the business case for change is actually pretty well developed right now in randomized trials and other forms of evidence. So we know what needs to be done. We're hearing more from people like your guests that have been there themselves and seen the opportunities. And the word needs to get out. So thank you for helping to spread the word.
Well, I appreciate your time this afternoon. Thanks so much for taking calls from our listeners. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
Dr. Julian Summers is a clinical psychologist at the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University. We'll continue a little bit on this topic, actually, in our next half hour as we hear about a new investment in supports for vulnerable youth that's coming up in our next half hour, as well as safety in sport from abuse. And we're going to hear from soccer player Sierra McCormack on what she thinks is needed when it comes to protecting athletes from abuse in sports. And we'd love to hear from you as well. How does the sport that you play address the issue of abuse? We'll take your calls on that in about 10 minutes from now. Right now, it's 12:32, 1:32 in the Mountain Time Zone, and it's time for a CBC News Update with Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. There's still no sign of a teenage girl missing in Golden Ears Park. 16-year-old Esther Wang got separated from her youth group yesterday afternoon. Maplebridge search and rescue teams have been searching through the night and morning, and police are using drones to help out. BC Ferries is cutting sailings this long weekend between Tawasin and Swartz Bay. The coastal celebration was supposed to be back in service, but that has been delayed. BC Ferries says it has reassigned more than 6,000 reservations to other vessels, so not everyone will be affected, but there will be less room for standby vehicles. And thousands of BC port workers could soon walk off the job. The Longshore and Warehouse Union of Canada has issued 72-hour strike notice. The union is seeking wage increases to help workers cope with rising inflation and the cost of living. And now taking a look at the forecast, the heat warning continues for Fort Nelson on the north coast. Rain this afternoon with a high of 15. Highs reaching 28 with smoke, some sunshine, and a chance of thunderstorms in the Peace. In the central interior, highs up to 29 with a risk of severe thunderstorms. You may see thunderstorms in the Kootenays as well. In the southern interior, a mix of sun and cloud with a high of 33. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, and the Fraser Valley, lots of sunshine this afternoon with highs in the low 20s. I'll have more local news at the top of the hour. Now back to Michelle with BC Today.
The evenings are particularly lovely these days.
Fantastic. I'm off at around 6:30, 7 o'clock, ride my bike home. Super pleasant.
Catch the sunset on your way. Wonderful.
Lovely.
Well, enjoy tonight.
Thank you.
Rob, thank you very much. Robert Zimmerman in our CBC Vancouver newsroom. Welcome back. You're with BC Today here on CBC Radio 1, live streaming as well on CBC Vancouver on YouTube and on cbc.ca/BC. You can also use the CBC Gem app. I'm Michelle Eliot. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, this morning, the BC government announced more services for young people with addictions challenges, spending $1.73 million toward the Dance Legacy Foundation to support therapists, social workers, and youth outreach workers for young people. And Dance Legacy provides mental health and addiction support for vulnerable youth. Tom Littlewood is the program director with Dance Legacy and joins me now. Good afternoon.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, thanks for joining us. It must have been interesting to you to hear our previous half hour. Tell us a bit about Dan's legacy and the work you do.
Well, Dan lost his life to a drug overdose, and his family responded by starting a family foundation. And they were involved for the first few years, but most family foundations kind of trickle out when they move on past the time. And it was beginning to trickle out, and they asked me to be a fundraiser for them, and I said no, but I'll be happy to design some programs and to experiment with these programs to see what's missing that would make a difference in Dan's life if he had access to them.
And what are those services?
So we started out providing trauma-informed therapists right where the kids were either in a school or a program like Aunt Leah's where they're getting housing, or at Raycam or these other community centers where they're accessing services. Because if they fail there at housing or going to school, it's not far to the street. We know that that about 1,000 plus youth age out every year. Another 1,000 probably should have been in care but weren't. So we have about 2,500 young people a year. We know 58% of them, this is a stat that SFU and another group have put together, will end up in entrenched addiction and homelessness within 3 to 5 years. When we get to see them, sometimes it's only months away or weeks away. Our whole goal is to be working in harm prevention. Harm reduction is essential. You have to keep people alive. But harm prevention is basically most kids. See, I don't believe we really have an opiate crisis. I think we have a trauma crisis, and kids have figured out how to self-medicate for the pain. Nobody would judge you if you broke your shoulder and you were hauled into emergency and they gave you the shot and the pain would go away. But a kid goes into emergency with an anxiety attack because of the trauma in their life. And if they're high or on an opiate, they're judged. They're considered criminals or weak or all this kind of stuff. And really, they're just figured out that they don't have to be in that kind of pain. So we really want to avoid, watching the rattle on the rattlesnake. That's the drug. The cause is trauma. I've experienced addiction in my life. I've seen a lot of young people with addiction over 45 years of practice as a therapist, and I've never met one yet that just was fooling around and it got out of control. Most kids that try an opiate, especially if they're not dealing with pain, they won't really like it. It's just it's a high, but they really want someone to deal with their pain.
They want that relief. So tell us about the wraparound services announced today. You were at BC Children's Hospital.
Yes. One of the ways we reach young people is we work with emergency departments. COVID really slowed that down, right? Because of what was happening in the hospitals. But now we're beginning a formal relationship with Children's Hospital to start with, and we'll be looking at some of the other hospitals we work with soon. And what we're looking at is an on-call service with a therapist available after hours or on weekends. And we have a team now of 11 therapists, and we'll be up to 18 by the end of this year if we can do our hiring. It's hard to find therapists that are ready for this because most therapists have trained to work with someone who can afford $75 to $150 an hour.
Yeah.
And an angry kid with purple hair and an attitude is something they're just not prepared for. I think it's great. I think the kids need an attitude to survive. And a good therapist can turn that into something positive. And the secret we do is we work with them for a minimum of 4 months. They can tap out any time, but we want them to commit. This is free to them, but it's not free. It's very expensive. So they need to be able to make appointments with us, keep appointments. We remind them, we give them a phone, we make sure they have the supports to do that. But 16 sessions is just for trauma a sweet spot if they really haven't had an addiction issue yet, and if they've really extensive trauma or an addiction, it'll take more than that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for sharing that your work with us. And so today's announcement involves those on-call therapists at BC Children's.
And parents and youth can get hold of us by going to our website, www.danslegacy.com. And kids can self-refer, and families can refer, or doctors or social workers can all refer at that portal.
Important information. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you so much for having us. Thanks.
That's Tom Littlewood, who is Program Director with the Dan's Legacy Foundation. 12:39 now, 1:39 in the Mountain Time Zone. You're with BC Today here on CBC Radio 1. I'm Michelle Eliot. Thanks so much for joining us. Good to have you with us, whether you're watching us on our live stream or listening to us on the radio. We can talk about sports now, and elite athletes are calling for safety for women and girls in sports and a fundamental rethink of how elite sports are governed in Canada. They say abuse is rampant in multiple sports, and they've been speaking before a House of Commons committee demanding a national public inquiry. In BC, a former provincial championship wrestler came forward claiming her coach sexually assaulted her at a party when she was a teenager, and says she is disappointed in what she calls the ridiculous complaints process. Madison Payette learned last month that her old coach, Aso Palani, had been suspended after a disciplinary panel found, on balance of probabilities, that he had assaulted her when she was 17. The coach was suspended for 3 years, half of which is already over. Now, she calls the length of time ridiculous.
They still don't know how to handle it at this point. It's quite shocking, if I'm being honest. And it's scary. To answer your question, it's frankly scary for young athletes coming up that in this day and age, this sort of thing is still happening. You know, at the time, you don't realize the impact it's going to have on the rest of your life until you finally hit an age where you realize like how wrong it really is. And, you know, it probably did affect my mental health.
That's Madison Payette, a former provincial championship wrestler. Now, Palani denies the allegations and is appealing the decision. He is not facing any criminal charges in the matter. The BC Wrestling Association updated its discipline and complaints policy after Payette's case so that sexual mistreatment of a minor moving forward will carry a presumptive sanction of a permanent ban. And in a statement to CBC, it says, "We firmly believe that we have a duty to ensure all athletes have a safety environment in which to compete and are committed to improving any safe sport initiatives." While we're taking your calls on this, what do you think is needed to prevent abuse in sport? How has the issue been addressed in a sport you play? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733 on your cell phone, star or pound 690. By email, we're bctoday@cbc.ca. Now, scandals within hockey, gymnastics, and soccer have put pressure on the government to take action. And a parliamentary committee has heard from athletes and advocates who are demanding a judicial inquiry into abuse in Canadian sport. One of them is Kira McCormack. She joins me now. Hello, good afternoon.
Hi, how are you?
I am okay. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, tell us about what you are calling for in front of the parliamentary committee. Why are you demanding a judicial inquiry?
I think it's very clear after the last, 6 months and all the athletes that have come forward with different stories of abuse that there's a serious, deep-seated problem in Canadian sport in regards to abuse. And I think the only way to if, again, they're serious about fixing it is a judicial inquiry to actually get to the root of understanding what the issues are, what the problem is. And I just think the whole system needs a whole surgery, and the only way to do that is a deep investigation that's outside of the system. And I just, obviously sports is so prevalent in our society. There's so many kids doing it. Kids are so vulnerable. Athletes are vulnerable. So I just think it's like a forest fire issue that needs immediate attention. And I think it's the only way that it's going to have even a chance of, eradicating abuse and at least trying to minimize the consequences of it.
Now, you play soccer. There have been a number of scandals in the sport. Former Team Canada and Vancouver Whitecaps women's soccer coach Bob Berarda was convicted of sex offenses. What is missing in the complaints process?
I think what's lacking is independence, to be honest, because, I was directly involved in the, attempt to report the Berarda situation and his initial firing. I was interviewed in that process, and unfortunately there was no oversight. So the Whitecaps and Canada Soccer decided to cover that up and, to protect their organization at the time in 2008, which allowed him to go back on the field and coach teenage girls for another decade until I came forward with my blog in 2019. And so, we reported even in that 10 years, to all sorts of, the soccer organizations. BC Soccer had a victim and a police report in front of them in 2017 and did nothing. Various media, the police, we literally tried to alert everybody and nobody did anything, which obviously on a mental level was extremely harmful for us, sort of knowing the seriousness of the situation, reporting it and not getting anywhere with that. So I just think there has to be independence outside of, these bodies, because I just think at the end of the day, the fundamental problem is that, organizations, when abuse happens, they're liable, and obviously they want to protect themselves from that liability. And, and so without that, removal and that independence, they're always, the group in power, which is the institutions, the organizations, they're always going to choose to protect themselves. And at this point, athletes, again, are just so vulnerable within the system. So I think it's that independence, you know, and then you need proper reporting channels, you need proper investigation channels, you need proper educational tools so players and parents recognize what abuse looks like, and then obviously then to have the reporting and the investigating after that.
How hopeful are you when it comes to change? That Canada Soccer put together a report and says it's committed to strengthening safe sport culture. How optimistic are you that because of all these conversations that there is going to be change within those organizations?
You know, the change is not going to come from the organizations themselves because, like I said, they're still going to be liable. I think there's been so much lipstick put on pigs in terms of, you know, and honestly, again, as an athlete that was affected by, you know, I wasn't sexually abused or harassed, but I witnessed my teammates going through it and obviously tried to report and for 10 years and the gaslighting that took place, you know, to me personally. So, you know, it makes me angry, honestly, when there's all this lip service, but no actual real action. And I think that's, again, where the government needs to step in and do this judicial inquiry, because at this point, you know, the change is not going to come from the institutions themselves. Of course, they're going to say all the right things and whatever, but the reality of the situation is that nothing structurally has changed since we've come forward, since athletes across multiple sports have come forward. And again, with the organizations being liable, they're not going to be the ones that change is going to come from. So we need the government. We need people to put pressure on their local MLAs and MPs to, like, you know, get behind this judicial inquiry and to, you know, it's the only way that change is going to happen is that if the structural issues are identified by an outside independent body who has nothing to do with a liability within the system, and that actual, you know, again, as people that have personally been affected and watched others, and again, listen to other sports, it has to happen. It has to change. And so, I mean, I think I'm hopeful in the sense that there's a large collective of us now that have been united behind the scenes and obviously in situations like we were in Parliament. And I think the public's starting to become aware of the issue. And I think lots of people have their kids in sports. Everybody votes. So I just think it's going to become hopefully an election issue. And I don't think we're going to stop. Well, I know we're not going to stop until we get there. So I think it's that collective determination that has me hopeful.
And on the topic of judicial inquiry, Minister of Sport Pascal Saint-Onge said the government will do something to address athlete concerns, hasn't yet decided whether there should be a public inquiry or some sort of investigation. So that from Minister of Sport Pascal Saint-Onge. This is BC Today here on CBC, and Kira McCormack joins me, a soccer player who's been speaking in front of a parliamentary committee and speaking about a need for an immediate judicial inquiry into abuse in Canadian sport. And we're asking you, what do you think is needed? Would you like to see that kind of independent oversight when it comes to sport? And how has the sport that you have played addressed the issue of abuse? What do you want to see? 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. On your cell phone, star or pound 690. Our email address is bctoday@cbc.ca. And Kira, so you talked about this a little bit, but what impact does this have on players when you don't have a robust complaints process?
You know, it's obviously it's very emotional kind of to talk about. You know, and I think
I'm sensitive to that, so please take care as
thank
you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I mean, it impacts people's lives. I mean, you know, I hope that the people that have watched, and I even hope some of the harm causers have seen firsthand just how, you know, again, it is really destroyed lives. It's caused people to just, you know, have so many pieces left to pick up after their sporting careers. You know, and like the harm is real. Like it's, you know, and I think that that's why it's a painful space to stay in, because obviously it's reliving a lot of, you know, just awful situations. And I think it continues to be traumatizing seeing a system. And again, like I have a lot of little kids that I care about in my life, and, you know, just knowing and having conversations with friends, like I have, you know, a couple of little nieces that are, you know, very athletic, and I don't want them to be in Canadian elite sport. Like at this point, like I really don't want them to be. And obviously I'm a highly, you know, very passionate, or was a very passionate athlete. So yeah, I mean, I just, like, again, it's human carnage is, I think, the best way that I can describe it. And It's just like, it just makes me, and I said it when I spoke in front of the MPs, but it makes me ashamed to be Canadian. Like, it really does, that this is, again, through our collective inaction, an acceptable way for our sports system to be, and this lack of action from, again, the Minister of Sport and other people. Like, we're so past the point of lip service, and there needs to be action. And so I just think, again, sitting within this system still the way it is highly traumatizing.
You mentioned, young people. How does this affect recruitment then, do you think? Or are people, you said you don't want her to go into professional sport. How is it affecting the way young people and their parents are even approaching this?
I think people now are aware, but, of course, I think what people have to realize is that, like, no system is ever going to be perfect. And of course, in every aspect of life, you're going to have bad apples sneak in the system. Do you know what I mean? And I think, but it's about how these organizations are handling those complaints. And at this point, like I said, because of the liability, they're choosing to cover it up. And so, I just, again, it's, of course, looking at even specifically at our situation, if this had been handled properly, like, it would have ended, it would have been over. This is dragged on now, and it's an absolute catastrophe from a publicity perspective with, Canada's soccer and soccer in Canada in general. And, and it's the cover up that has caused, and the choices that people in leadership have made in terms of how they've handled these situations. So, again, that bad publicity, of course, is going to affect participation numbers. If I was a parent, I would not want my child being involved in elite level sport, and obviously, all the money and all that comes with that. So yeah, absolutely, it's having an economic impact. And the sooner we get to the bottom of it, the sooner we make sport a safe place in Canada. Again, it's tied economically in a positive way.
Let me just acknowledge the trauma that we're talking about. So I want to mention that support is available for anyone affected by this discussion. You can speak with a mental health professional at Wellness Together Canada, and that's 1-866-585-0445. Young people can text wellness to 686868. Adults can text wellness, the word wellness, to 741-741. And if you miss those numbers, you can find them by searching online for Wellness Together Canada. I do want to note as well that our next call here will have some sensitive content, so do take care. Kimmy is joining us now in Richmond. Hi, Kimmy.
Hi.
Hi, thanks for calling. What did you want to share?
Well, I just wanted to, I really feel a lot of compassion and anger that this is just lingering on and on and on. And I just think, it's time for legislation and policy to catch up to what's going on. And I didn't directly experience sexual misconduct, but I was an elite athlete, and the environment was so hypersexualized that I just dropped out and, stopped playing competitive sports. I was an adult by then, but I only realized later how much I had been affected by the behavior of, in this case, Bob Berarda, and, as a soccer coach. And there are women working all these years to continue to press for change in this particular instance, but, in so many sports. And I just wanted to bring up the fact that a lot of times it's not just sexual misconduct. It's also just this general environment of hypersexualization. It's very confusing for young people. You're just figuring out who you are. And a lot of times there's intense homophobia as well that is cultivated in these environments. And, for folks who are maybe not even realizing their sexuality or sexual orientation or gender expression, it can be extremely confusing to be in this hypersexualized environment. And it, it's unsafe for people in the LGBTQ community in these environments. And so that's just another aspect, I think, that needs to be included in this process.
Kimmy, thank you so much for your call. I appreciate that you took the time, and I'm sure that emotionally that was hard for you. Thanks so much for calling.
Yeah, and my voice is quivering. I just want to say, kudos to all of the people who've been working on this and who have had the courage to come forward and continue at it. Continue to knock at the doors of the patriarchy. And I hope that this finally results in some big change. Thank you.
Thank you. You take care, okay, after you hang up the phone. That's Kimmy joining us from Richmond. I just have about a minute left, Kira, but she talked there about the environment, the atmosphere within sport. How do you change that?
I mean, I just think we need to have a whole rethink about what success and what is the point of us, running elite sport and sport in general. And I just think at the end of the day, it's about, a healthy, positive growth experience. And I think that needs to recenter and become the focus of what sport is. And obviously all the well-being, the physical and mental components that come with a healthy environment. And I just think that that's kind of the foundation that a new sport structure needs to be built from. And, and again, it's such an integral part of our society as Canadians. And I just think that care and, that the importance of that being a safe environment needs to be at the forefront. Again, starting with the National Judicial Inquiry in terms of understanding how we got here and then, how we can move forward.
I have 30 seconds left, but how optimistic are you that will happen?
I'm optimistic in the sense that I think there's a collective group of people now that are not going to stop until we get there. And I think that there's momentum gathering from the public. And I think that that's going to translate into political capital that hopefully if politicians aren't going to do the right thing to do the right thing, they'll do the right thing because they'll lose an election if they don't. And I think that that's hopefully the direction that this is heading.
Really appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Take care. Kira McCormack is a professional soccer player with Treaty United. And again, support is available for you at Wellness Together. You can look up Wellness Together Canada online. That's it for our show today. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us. Thanks for listening and watching. I'm Michelle Eliot. Have a great afternoon.